In mid-June 2023, an event occurred in Claremont County, Ohio, that will be remembered for a long time by residents of this quiet and seemingly peaceful area. It was an ordinary hot summer day. In the morning, the streets were serene, and children were playing on the roadsides while adults were doing business. In the distance, on one of the streets, stood the house of the Doerman family, a one-story house with a white wooden facade and a small front garden, which looked so peaceful that no one could imagine what kind of tragedy it would soon hide behind its walls. The Doerman family consisted of parents, 33-year-old Chad and his wife Laura. Laura had a daughter from a previous relationship, at that time 14 years old, and 3 young sons who were born in a marriage with Chad: Clayton, 7 years old, Hunter, 4 years old, and Chase, barely 3. Residents of the area were poorly acquainted with this family, but everyone knew that the Dorman children often played together in the backyard or went to the playground at home. Chad was also seen, who was more than once seen either working in the garden or fixing a car in the driveway. He was not a particularly sociable person and rarely entered into conversations with neighbors, but he seemed polite and calm, although there was sometimes a shadow of anxiety in his gaze. That day, everything went on as usual until closer to noon. Loud and shrill sounds came from the Doerman's house, which, as witnesses later claimed, they could not immediately identify. It was only a few seconds later that someone realized they were gunshots. One of the nearest neighbors, who happened to be on the veranda and heard the sounds, thought it might be the popping of exhaust from a car or even children's fireworks, although it was still far from the holidays. However, soon the sounds were repeated, and at that moment the neighbor no longer doubted that he was hearing something more sinister. At about the same time, the 911 service received an alarm call from a woman who, with tears in her eyes and despair in her voice, screamed that her children were in danger. In a panic, she asked for help to be sent immediately. It was Laura Dorman, and her call sounded so heartbreaking that the dispatcher on the other end of the line couldn't immediately ask the right questions. The woman was breathing raggedly, and her words sometimes became incomprehensible, but soon the situation became clear. Shots had been fired in the house where the family was staying, and children could be among the victims. The police arrived at the scene almost immediately. Several patrols were sent to the family's house. The officers approached the house cautiously, ready for any surprise. Some of the neighbors, worried but afraid to get too close, watched from behind windows and doorsteps. No one could believe that a tragedy would unfold before their eyes, which would soon cause a flurry of discussions and become the subject of more than one court session. When the police went inside, they found Chad Doerman on the threshold of one of the rooms. According to the officers, his face was pale, his gaze was cold, almost impassive. He did not resist or try to escape. On the contrary, it seemed that he was calmly waiting for law enforcement officers. There was a dead silence around, broken only by the excited screams of Laura, who was rushing around the house, not understanding what had happened and how this tragedy could have happened to her children. The first seconds after the father's arrest became key for the police. They quickly assessed the situation after seeing the boys' bodies and realizing that help had come too late. Chad and Laura's 3 young sons, as it turned out later, no longer showed signs of life. This picture, according to the officers, was one of the most tragic views they had ever seen. The situation was so shocking that none of the police officers on the scene could fully comprehend the scale of what had happened. In the following hours, traffic began in the area. Emergency services, reporters, and police representatives gathered at the house, and the news of the tragedy gradually spread among residents. No one could believe that a father could commit such an act towards his own children. At that time, the answers to the main questions remained hidden. What could have provoked this tragedy, and what internal conflicts forced Chad to take such a step? Police arrived at the Dorman family's home in a quiet Ohio suburb shortly after receiving an emergency call. From the outside, the house looked ordinary, not standing out from others in this area, where every house and yard holds the stories of family life and everyday life. However, A completely different picture awaited them here. The police sergeant, who was the first to enter, stopped for a moment, trying to comprehend what was happening. The patrolman examined the room and noticed that there was that silence that often remains at the sites of tragedies. When simple details of the house turn into evidence, each object acquires a new meaning, becoming part of something more significant. The interior was filled with a lot of children's things: toys, school supplies, photographs, each of which told about the atmosphere in which the Dorman family lived. The kitchen, the living room, the bedrooms. All the rooms seemed to look like in any family. But at that moment, the house seemed somehow alien, filled with a sense of anxiety, as if time itself had frozen. The officer's attention was attracted by several items scattered in the hallway, small items that had obviously been left by children. These small details seemed to stop the police and remind them that they were not at the usual scene of the incident, but in the house where something frightening and irreparable had happened. The patrolman carefully examined the rooms, checking every detail. Forensic specialists soon began documenting the situation and recorded the situation for subsequent analysis. Their task was to understand what happened here and how events unfolded. They photographed the rooms, made detailed notes about the position of furniture, objects, and even children's toys, which seemed to contain fragments of children's memories. This house, full of traces of the presence of children, now looked more like a museum of their lives. In every room, the police found footprints that spoke of the last moments before the tragedy. The younger children, Hunter and Chase, were playing in the living room, among bright toys that they might have looked at with joy in the morning. Clayton, the eldest son, was probably in one of the bedrooms when the events began. His position in the room suggested that he could be next to his mother. Every detail, every place in the house, served as a pointer to recreate the events of that morning. It is noteworthy that there were no signs of a struggle in the house, which gave investigators reason to assume that events developed rapidly and without warning. In the kitchen, which served as the heart of the house, there were children's drawings made with colored pencils. Vivid images stared at the investigators from the drawings: trees, the sun, smiling faces, and inscriptions made in uneven children's handwriting. One of the drawings, made in bright colors, depicted a family on a picnic. Children dressed in colorful t-shirts and adults smiling in the shade of a tree. This simple but symbolic drawing seemed especially important for the investigation, showing how the members of this family would like to see each other. It was such details that gave an idea of what life was like for the Dormans in ordinary days, before everything changed. Laura Dorman was also in the house, who was going through a severe shock at that moment. She couldn't speak, barely conscious. The officers tried to calm her down and offer her medical attention while the forensics team continued their work. Next to her was her daughter from a previous relationship, who became an unwitting witness to the tragic events. The girl, who had experienced one of the most severe shocks in her life, was in a state where it was difficult to distract her from her thoughts and help her realize what had happened. She avoided looking at the rooms from where she could see the children's things that had recently been part of her brother's ordinary lives. In a state of shock, she sat quietly next to her mother, who kept asking herself the same question: why? Meanwhile, criminologists were carefully examining the house, trying to restore the chronology of events. Investigators drew attention to the door leading to the children's room, where there were beds neatly tucked in with blankets with children's patterns. On one of the bedside tables, there was a small book with a bright cover which, probably one of the children had read the day before. This cozy corner of the house has become a symbol of the fact that there was a life interrupted too suddenly. When experts examined the house and recorded the evidence, attention was attracted by the gun found in the house, which became a key piece of evidence in the investigation. His very presence in the house required an explanation. The officers determined that the weapon was registered in the name of Chad Dorman, which means he had a legal right to keep it. However, as the police later noted, there was no reason to believe that it was this weapon that would cause such dramatic events. Nevertheless, His presence became an important link in the chain of evidence, thanks to which investigators began to build a logical line of events, which soon allowed them to get answers to key questions about the incident. Every room in the house resembled a childhood dream, embodied in a cozy atmosphere filled with toys, books, and colorful drawings. The whole setting seemed to reflect the love for children, reminded of each of the little inhabitants of the house, whose joys and games had recently filled the rooms with the sounds of laughter and fun. And yet, despite this atmosphere of warmth and care, the picture presented to the investigators was full of dumb questions that could only be answered by further police work and the collected evidence. Next to the police officers working at the scene, there were also psychological support specialists who arrived to help Laura and her daughter. They knew that it was important to maintain the emotional balance of the witnesses and make sure that they could survive the incident with minimal psychological consequences. Support turned out to be necessary, as Laura, as noted by the police, was experiencing a strong shock, realizing that the familiar world of her family would no longer be the same. With each new element of the investigation, a picture of events that seemed incomprehensible to the relatives and neighbors of the Dorman family was recreated. After the examination, the investigators concluded that Chad could have acted in a state of strong emotional tension. But this conclusion required further investigation and analysis to understand what could have been the true cause of the events. After a thorough examination of the scene and the first interrogations of witnesses, investigators began to develop key elements of the crime in which Chad Dorman himself turned out to be the central figure. All the evidence found, his behavior and words during his detention, all pointed to his direct involvement in the tragedy that occurred in this house. At the first moment, when the police arrived at the scene, he did not try to escape or hide, remained at the scene and listened to questions with a noticeable lack of emotion. Even the most experienced police officers admitted later that his aloofness and serenity at that moment seemed unnatural, contrary to the usual reaction to such events. As soon as the investigators began questioning, it became clear that Chad might not have been going to deny his involvement in the incident. His answers sounded monotonous. He did not try to put forward an alibi or an excuse, which increased the suspicions of the police. When asked about the events of that day, he did not deny his role in the tragedy, although he did not initially disclose details. This behavior gave investigators reason to assume that Chad might have some ulterior motive or circumstances that led to such a decision. During several hours of interrogation, he admitted the facts, but did not try to explain what exactly caused his actions. Such silence raised more questions than it answered. In such cases, suspects, as a rule, either deny the charges or try to explain their act by some logical justification, for example, by acting in a state of passion. But in this case, Chad seemed to just accept his guilt, which in itself looked suspicious. The officers described him as a man who, as if resigned in advance to the inevitability of punishment, and not seeking to justify himself either to others or to himself. This behavior, coupled with his confession, seemed to indicate that the crime had been planned in advance, and its consequences were obvious to him. After Chad's confession, the police directed all efforts to find out possible reasons and motives that could have pushed him to such a radical and incomprehensible act. An investigative team was set up that focused on analyzing his life, psychological state, and family circumstances. This was necessary in order to understand what exactly could cause such internal changes in a person, lead to a decision that shocked the whole neighborhood. Investigators conducted a series of interviews with colleagues, friends, and relatives of Chad in order to get the most complete picture of his personality and possible internal conflicts. As a result of these conversations, some disturbing details have come to light that could help explain his behavior. Chad's colleagues, who work with him at one of the local enterprises, noted that in recent months he has increasingly begun to show signs of anxiety and detachment. One of his colleagues recalled that Chad repeatedly mentioned the feeling of constant pressure and fatigue, although he did not name specific reasons for this. Other witnesses claimed that he may have been in a state of emotional burnout, but, like many people, he simply did not realize it. There were signs of depression in his behavior, but none of his acquaintances had any thoughts that it could end this way. One of Chad's friends recalled how, a few weeks before the tragedy, he invited him to go fishing, which was their long-standing tradition. According to him, Chad was especially silent that day and looked depressed. When asked what was bothering him, he replied that he was just tired. The friend did not insist on talking, deciding that Chad was going through the usual difficulties of life. As it turned out later, this ordinary day was the last time anyone saw Chad in a relatively calm state. During the investigation, it was found that Chad could also have certain difficulties in the family, although at first, none of the relatives considered them serious. Laura, his wife, admitted during the interrogation that there had been disagreements between them recently, but, according to her, she never thought that this could lead to tragedy. They tried to maintain family relations, for the sake of the children, and discussed ways to solve the problems that arose. Laura described her husband as a man of restraint, but never prone to aggression. However, in recent months, she had noticed that he had become increasingly withdrawn and at times avoided talking, preferring to spend time alone. Soon, as part of the investigations, Chad's accounts and social media correspondence were checked to find possible financial or personal difficulties that could affect his mental state. During these checks, the police did not find significant debts or financial problems, but there were several disturbing correspondence in which he shared thoughts about a hard life and pressure that is difficult to withstand. These messages could indicate hidden emotional problems that he did not dare to talk about openly. Although his acquaintances did not take these hints seriously, they became an important aspect of the investigation for the investigators. Further, the investigation attracted psychology specialists who helped to analyze the psychological state of the child. Experts pointed out that his behavior could be the result of hidden mental or emotional disorders that he may not have realized or did not want to admit. Such conditions often worsen with the accumulation of stress, and, as the investigation showed, the child could face factors such as chronic fatigue and emotional burnout. Psychologists also noted that his calm behavior at the crime scene could be associated with a state of emotional isolation or detachment from reality, which, unfortunately, is not uncommon in such cases. At the same time, the police were actively checking for possible family conflicts and tension existing within the family. Investigators found out that Chad and his wife periodically had disagreements about parenting and the distribution of household responsibilities. Laura said in her testimony that sometimes their arguments concerned financial issues and plans for the future. But despite this, she did not think that their differences were anything beyond the usual family difficulties. And although the investigation did not reveal significant fact confirming the existence of deep conflicts, experts drew attention to the fact that Chad may have perceived his life differently from those around him. Often, even seemingly insignificant events can be of great importance for a person who's in a state of emotional stress. The specialists who worked with his case also noted that he could feel lonely and not receive enough support, which aggravated his internal condition. During the interrogations, Chad did not show aggression or a desire to defend himself. This only reinforced the police's version that he had realized the consequences of his actions in advance and was ready to take responsibility. However, at the same time, his behavior did not give an unambiguous answer to the question of why he took such a step. So, during the investigation, the police came to the conclusion that all the evidence and Chad's behavior give grounds to suspect him of a premeditated crime. The trial of Chad Dorman began several months after his arrest, when the investigation gathered all the evidence and testimony to present them to the court. This tragedy shocked not only a small community in Ohio, but also caused a wave of discussion across the country as the story reached a wide audience through the media. Every stage of the case was under public scrutiny, and many expected the harshest possible sentence for the accused. The courtroom was attended by journalists, representatives of local media, and just concerned residents who hoped that justice would prevail. The first session began with an accusatory speech by the prosecutor, who detailed his version of events in front of the court and the jury. The prosecutor immediately stated that this crime was premeditated and deliberate. In his opening speech, he stressed that the accused knew what he was doing and did not try to hide his actions or find an excuse, which, according to the prosecution, excluded the possibility of chance or affect. We are dealing with a man who, as a father, betrayed his main purpose, the protection and care of children, the prosecutor said, addressing the jury and judges. The prosecutor's words sounded loud and confident, reflecting the firm position of the prosecution and leaving little doubt about his serious intentions. Chad Dorman's confession, made shortly after his arrest, was central to the prosecution's evidence base. During the interrogation, he did not deny his guilt, and this confession became the basis for the charge of premeditated murder. The court was presented with detailed reports from experts, criminologists, and photographs from the crime scene, which together gave the jury a complete picture of the scale of the tragedy. The prosecution stressed that there were no signs of struggle or self-defense, and the evidence found indicated that the crime was prepared. This indicated that the accused did not act impulsively, but took this step, realizing the consequences. The hearings were accompanied by testimony from eyewitnesses and experts who explained in detail the evidence gathered. Special attention was paid to the psychological analyses of Chad conducted as part of the investigation. The prosecutor argued that, despite some isolation and signs of possible emotional problems, Chad was sane and aware of the nature of his actions. This aspect of the case was important for the prosecution, as it allowed to exclude arguments about temporary insanity or an insurmountable mental disorder. Psychologists interviewed by the court confirmed that the accused understood his actions and could control them, despite possible stress and psychological stress. For his part, the defense attorney tried to build a defense on the version of the mental crisis that Chad Dorman was allegedly experiencing. The lawyer claimed that the accused was in a state of emotional exhaustion and was experiencing serious psychological difficulties that could lead to tragic consequences. He insisted on conducting additional psychological examinations, believing that they could reveal signs of a severe mental condition. However, the court, after submitting the initial results of the survey, considered that there were insufficient grounds for such measures. Experts unanimously stated that Chad had full self-control and understood what he was doing. These conclusions became a decisive argument for the court, which strengthened confidence in the premeditation of his actions. One of the most dramatic moments of the trial was the performance of Laura, Chad's wife and the mother of the dead children. Laura testified, talking about family difficulties, about the changes in her husband's behavior that became noticeable a few months before the tragedy. She talked about his closeness and sullen mood, which gradually became more and more noticeable. According to her, he avoided conversations, withdrew into himself more often, and sometimes it seemed that he was experiencing severe internal pain. However, Laura also admitted that she could never have imagined that this would lead to tragedy. Her testimony was steeped in pain and bitterness of loss, and many of those present could not hold back tears as they listened to her words. Her testimony played an important role in forming a general understanding of family relations and possible motives of the child. Laura told the court that there were tense moments behind an outwardly calm life, but they never escalated into something that could portend such a terrible outcome. These testimonies added to the tragedy of the process, emphasizing how unexpected Chad's act was for his loved ones. However, they also showed that although there were difficulties between the spouses, they were not so serious as to serve as an excuse for what was done. After completing the interrogations and presenting all the evidence, both sides made closing speeches. The prosecutor again emphasized that Chad's actions were deliberate and stressed that there were no mitigating circumstances that could justify such an act. He noted that the trial should be an example of how betrayal of the closest ones cannot go unpunished. The defense, in turn, continued to insist on the difficult emotional state of the accused, which, according to the lawyer, could have played a key role in the tragedy. However, the arguments of the defense did not have a significant impact on the court's decision, since numerous evidence and psychological conclusions left no doubt about Chad's guilt. After several weeks of proceedings, the court completed consideration of all the case materials and listened to the closing words of the prosecution and defense. The jury went to a discussion that lasted several hours. In the end, they unanimously ruled Chad Doerman guilty of the premeditated murder of his children.
Count 1, I'll impose a prison sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. No fine will be imposed.
The judge, after listening to the jury's decision, handed down a sentence: life imprisonment without the right to parole. This harsh sentence reflected not only the gravity of the crime, but also the firm position of the court that such acts should be suppressed with the strictest possible measures. The judge noted in his opinion that in this case the crime was so serious that society cannot risk the possibility of the accused's release in the future. The verdict caused a sense of satisfaction among those who were waiting for justice, although no verdict could restore the children's lives and ease the mother's pain. Thus, the trial ended with the imposition of the most severe punishment, which reflected the degree of public outrage and the commitment of justice to the principles of the inevitability of punishment for violent crimes. Chad Dorman's sentence provoked a strong public response, both in his native community and across the country. The tragedy has prompted local and national media to discuss topics related to mental health, family conflicts, and support measures that can prevent such cases. Local residents and organizations have expressed support for Laura and her daughter by organizing memorial services for the dead children and helping the family. This case has become a painful reminder for society of how important it is to pay attention to early signals of stress and crises in families. The Chad Doerman case left a deep mark in the hearts of those who followed the investigation and the trial. This tragedy not only destroyed one family, but also affected an entire community, becoming a grim reminder of the fragility of family ties and the need for timely psychological help. The society, shocked by the brutality of this crime, began to think more actively about the importance of paying attention to the early signs of emotional and psychological problems that may be brewing within the family. Initiatives have been proposed to the authorities and local communities aimed at expanding psychological assistance, creating hotlines to support families in crisis situations, and organizing preventive training programs to recognize signs of crisis. Although the court's verdict provided punishment for Chad, this story reminded everyone that only increased support and awareness measures can help prevent similar tragedies in the future. The tragic case of the Doerman family will remain a lesson that encourages change and strengthens the value of human life and the well-being of children.